Hello, everybody. We are here with Lara Putnam. She is a professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh who studies gender, labor, and politics. And the reason why we invited her here today is because she has also studied and researched grassroots mobilization in Pennsylvania from 2017 and beyond. So she's we're all in the same boat here. She's going to tell us a little bit about herself, what she does, and how we can use some of the things she's researched so that we can be more effective in our homes where we need to be. So with that, I am going to pass it on to Lara. Take it away, Lara.
Great. Well, so thank you so much for inviting me to be here. And I guess I'll share a little bit about what we know about how political mobilization and engagement works, but then hopefully we can just, talk, because just as you say, we're all kind of in an unexpected, unprecedented moment here when so many of the grassroots groups that had formed after 2017 and had really built up a toolkit of things that worked for engaging and pulling people in suddenly find that lots of the techniques that we've been using in the face of, shutdown, coronavirus, limits on being in the public sphere, suddenly everything is different. So there are no easy or obvious answers, and I think all the experts would agree with the practitioners and volunteers like yourselves that everyone's working, trying to understand it as they, as we make stuff up as we move along. So the big picture of the last 3 years is that in the wake of Donald Trump's election, across the country, people who had been only somewhat involved with politics, but not as professionals and not necessarily in an ongoing way, stepped forward in a massive way to put sort of rebuilding American politics from the bottom up at the forefront of their lives. And this was particularly concentrated among a group that a sort of demographic slice of people that hadn't been hyper politically involved before. So it's particularly often college educated women from sort of middle age onward, folks especially concentrated in more suburban areas, folks from their 40s to 50s to 60s to 70s, and often not people who thought of themselves as being politically radical at all, simply people who were sort of civic minded, had always thought that it was meaningful to them to be part of a community that worked and part of a society that worked, and they kind of thought that they were until Donald Trump was elected, and suddenly a bunch of folks woke up and said, wow, things must be broken in so many different places for us to be in, for this result to have gotten here. And as people stepped forward and got involved in politics, whether that was protesting outside of a senator's office once a week and meeting other people during that protest and building outward their connections to find other folks shared their feelings, or starting to knock on doors in their, say, neighborhood where they maybe assumed, maybe they're out in this, sort of upscale suburbs, they assumed that everyone around them was a Republican, only to discover once they started knocking doors, there were lots of people who shared their views. And so small sort of nucleuses of people built outward and formed informal and then somewhat more formalized groups. And probably that's sort of the story with Tuesdays with Toomey as well, right? And so some of the different things that sort of formed the nucleus of these sort of cells that spread outward included, again, weekly protests outside of particular politicians' office spaces. Sometimes it was people who got together women who got together to charter a bus with other swim team moms or other moms they knew through Girl Scouts to charter a bus to go down to Washington, D.C. for the first Women's March that ended up then building on those ties and forming a local group, and then realizing that there were all sorts of different offices, different local political offices that they had not been paying much attention to, and that they suddenly felt that they had a mission that they needed to pay attention to, whether sometimes that was about within local Democratic Party structures, people ran for committee person or precinct person or ward committees or township committees, and ended up stepping into the leadership of their local township Democratic committee or ward or even county level Democratic committee. Sometimes it was about town councils or school board seats, where in many cases, offices that hadn't been contested by Democrats in a lot of the Philly collar counties, you've seen this happen pretty close up where you are, and similarly in some of the suburbs north and south of the city of Pittsburgh, seats that had been basically held by Republicans in town councils or in school boards, as long as anyone can remember, were contested and then won by sort of new citizen volunteers stepping forwards. And it has not only been women, but it's been a lot of women. And it hasn't only been people who always look the same. So especially in more urban areas, people have often the new volunteers are themselves not necessarily that diverse demographically. So it's disproportionately, again, folks with college degrees, disproportionately not people of color. But especially in places where the Democratic electorate looks a lot more diverse than that, people have tried to be very intentional about working in coalition with other groups, whether that's working in coalition with immigrant rights groups, working with coalition with racial justice groups, so that sort of ironically in some places, this sort of surge of women stepping in and getting involved has ended up electing into office a much wider range of people than the local Democratic sort of insiders had traditionally been represented by, right? So this has been has opened up spaces for people with further to the left with more progressive ideas on whether it's on immigration, housing, criminal justice, and more in some more urban areas. And also, sort of equally ironically, that's the same kind of organizing among again, new women stepping into political action in areas that are more rural or farther outside of Democratic strongholds, has instead led to support for candidates who are really maybe whose politics are far more centrist than the women activists who are supporting them, but who are right for the district. And so you've had this sort of phenomenon of just new fuel, new volunteer energies flowing into the political system. And then who ends up getting elected as a result of that doesn't always look like the folks doing the activism. Sometimes it's more diverse, sometimes it's ideologically more diverse, and sometimes it's like the new women volunteers themselves who've gotten so activated that they realize that they want to be not just supporting others have a voice at the table, but they're ready to have that voice themselves. And part of what's been really important is a whole bunch of tools that people have sort of innovated for reaching outside of their own bubbles, their own social networks. So how do we not just preach to the converted? If I have a particular set of political views and maybe all of my friends kind of sound like me, I have those same views. What do I do that's gonna allow me to take my energy and my passion and try to persuade someone other than people who already think the same way that I do? So in some ways, the kind of street protests that Tuesdays with Toomey, for instance, I used to do until we were all in lockdown, has that function of sort of stepping out into the public sphere, holding up a sign to folks who are passing and saying, hey, come join us, here's what we think. So it has that characteristic of reaching out across divides. And in smaller scale ways, even like, wearing a pin for a candidate who you're supporting, and so that in the grocery store, maybe someone asks you, oh, is there a primary coming up? I wasn't paying attention to that. And so then you've got a conversation going that reaches across those social networks. Or in a much more formal way, working on a campaign, knocking on doors, you're literally breaking out of your own network to knock on a door and have a conversation and message to someone who you weren't previously connected to. And this brings us around to the question of, well, what do we do now? Because all of those examples that I've given you really depend on being able to use face-to-face connection, right? To use the possibility of having a conversation, of showing a sign to someone who wasn't previously listening to you, wasn't someone who you knew previously, right? And building that connection. And sort of similarly, like showing up to a protest in support of immigrants' rights, or showing up for the Women's March. Those are ways of people coming together and breaking outside of media bubbles or established narratives. And so I think a lot of people on the sort of broad center to left at this moment of coronavirus feel like exactly the tools that people had sort of figured out over the course of 3 years, innovated, figured out how to use, tested, run through multiple electoral cycles, honed, were like ready and poised to, organize people, got ready to put into action, and suddenly it's all wiped away in the sense of like all the techniques that people were planning to use in this electoral cycle are pretty much off the boards. for the moment, except for phone banking. And I do hear that phone banking is going, so lots more people are at home than have been. People are more ready to have longer conversations than they have been. So phone banking and the possibilities of phone banking are, I think, one important thing to take out of, like, you know, like, which maybe that had been like on plan D or something. No one likes doing phone banking. Think about pushing that up to plan A, because so a lot of the techniques that allowed people to reach out beyond their social networks are off the table, right? And more of our lives, as we're living with coronavirus, things are going through mediated forms, whether that's through social media or through paid media, right? Because almost literally, folks who are not essential workers, and that's an important distinction, right? Because they're, but people who are not essential workers, and who are basically under shelter-at-home orders, are interacting with the outside world increasingly.
So Lara is going to finish her thought, but it looks like she might be having some internet connectivity issues. Uh-oh. Everyone's
It's
having.
more important than
Oh.
ever.
Lara?
Yeah.
Can you repeat your last sentence? Because I think I must have had some internet connectivity issues, so
Okay.
it didn't make it. Yeah, my internet's suddenly unstable. All right, let's just, yeah, whatever you said, like for the last 15 seconds, it was totally lost on the recording.
So what I was saying was precisely that, because almost all of our if we're under shelter-in-place orders and we're not essential workers, so we're not going out into the world, almost all of our understanding of what's happening is coming through a mediated form, whether that's the paid formal media, the news media, through social media, or through communications channels like Zoom or like Facebook or like Twitter, that curate, or that allow us to sort of self-curate who we talk to, right? So through Zoom, you could, in theory, talk to anybody, but probably you don't talk to anybody on Zoom. You talk to your coworkers, you talk to your family members, you might talk to the members of your church or synagogue, you might talk to the members of your child's school. Mm-hmm. So part of what that shows us is that our pre-existing social networks are even more important in terms of channeling our communications under, you know, coronavirus lockdown. Those pre-existing social networks we can tap into those and communicate along them, but we can't break out of them as easily. And so the challenge, I think, for grassroots groups now is sort of threefold. You've got to think, okay, what are the routes along which communication is happening now? It's existing social networks. Okay, do we have existing social networks that are politically heterogeneous? Because like politically homogenous social networks are right now, they're kind of like tapped out, which is to say, like, if I have a politically homogenous social network, there's no one within it who I can convince, because they're already convinced. So literally, that's why we're homogenous. We're all already convinced. Okay, but are there other social networks that I'm connected to that are not politically homogenous? Then those are spaces where connections can be a space for political dialogue, for persuasion, for even, and when I say homogenous, I don't just mean in terms of like, am I a registered Democrat or a registered Republican, but even like, am I someone who thinks that voting in every election is totally critical, or am I cynical about that? Or do I not have access to the information that I need to get the mail-in ballot, right? Yeah. So political homogeneity isn't just about a single sort of left to right spectrum. It's also about like, how do I perceive which aspect, like how do I understand myself as a political actor in the world? So it's possible that you and probably the network of people who are sort of core activists within Tuesdays with Toomey is pretty politically homogenous, right? But all of you are probably also members of other social networks, if you think about it, that are not. Is that about like my folks I went to high school with? Is that about who, and then like that's also a sort of social network that I'm connected to? Or is it about people who belong to a different, you know, the school, you know, the PTO, or is it about my church or my synagogue? So people, there may be, and then one of the most important and most powerful existing social networks that are politically heterogeneous in this country, in Pennsylvania for sure, is union networks. So labor networks, for instance, of folks who are unionized nurses, unionized service workers, unionized building trades, all of those social networks, the networks of people who know each other through unions are very politically heterogeneous. You've got lots of people, registered Republicans, registered Democrats, people who think of themselves as voters and think of that as part of their identity, and people who don't. So those exist, the networks of communication that unions are part of are likely to be more important than ever in this electoral cycle, precisely because it's not made up of people who think about politics in the same way, but it is made up of people who know that they've got some things in common. And so that communicating along those labor networks is a space of potential persuasion, dialogue, political discussion that can shift minds, or that can help people see themselves as political actors differently. And then the final piece of this is thinking about news media and social media and saying, are we being as effective as possible? And just to take an example, which I think will be in many people's front of mind, it's been quite striking over the last couple of days to see these sort of headlines nationally in all of the national papers about these huge anti-shutdown protests, calling out.
Huge is a strong term.
Right. Yeah. So that's the headline. So the headline is like huge protest. And then you go down and you're like, okay, that was 100 people in Lansing. And
yeah, I gotta say, let's be real. We've been doing this for once a week, bringing in sometimes 100, 200, 300 people. And we're lucky if we get a news camera.
Never. Totally.
And we're being responsible by not having in-person protests. It's actually really irritating me. We took the effort to be responsible, and that has not helped us.
It is super striking. So I've been, over the last 48 hours, I've been just naming numbers. Do you know how many people showed up to protest on December 17th alone, Impeachment Eve? There were, across the country, at least counted, that we've tallied, 599 separate different protests. That one very cold December night, which encompassed a total of probably about 90,000 people nationwide. And the only political commentary, the only headlines about impeachment was, why isn't there more popular support for it? There was no coverage of these protests, much less no one called them huge, no one called them nationwide. It's 600 people. 600 events, scores of thousands of people. Apparently it doesn't count.
Right.
It doesn't fit the sort of media image of the angry white Trump voter. Somehow it falls into a different slot. So there's a lot you can have,
I also think there's some novelty to it, because in some ways, in some ways, consistency, I feel is our greatest advantage. And in some ways it allows people to just be oh, there they are again. Yeah, we know they're going to do that.
Yeah. So anyway, it's weird that way, right? Yeah, no, I completely agree. But it's super striking, because the other example that I give is that the Lights for Liberty protest, which I know you all participated in, many other people did, other groups did. So all told, there were over 700 different individual, locally organized. None of this AstroTurf, no top-down organizing. So over 700 events, somewhere between 100,000 and 120,000 people nationwide participated, all across the country. And there was not a single article not even mention in any article in the Washington Post or New York Times, period.
Yes, it's really frustrating.
So it's a weird thing. But so then the question is, okay, what do we need to do the question for your group is, what do we need to do? Are we not making ourselves available enough to reporters to talk about, our perspective? Are there ways that we can be, is there a social distancing appropriate way to go, stand along a street and do one of these human billboards, but 6 feet apart, on a busy, but this is a thing, holding big signs, and, letting the media know. So, can we sort of redouble our efforts to think about our media strategy and social media strategy?
And the Never Again Action Group, but I know especially Shutdown Berks has had some local car protests where they've been driving by places and doing a lot of horn beeping with signs off on their cars, which I think has, but again, it surprises me why these groups also don't get the same media attention as a bunch of, I mean, I think a part of it is because we look at those angry Trump supporters and we're like, well, why are you're putting a lot of other lives in danger? So in a way, being responsible makes you less newsworthy.
Yeah, it's really hard to say. And I think I think there is some sort of baseline assumption. I don't know. I mean, it's very, very striking. And I think that the there's some phenomenon which the sort of mainstream media sort of tries to bend over backwards to make sure that they're giving a sympathetic hearing to what they perceive as being a range of political views. But that actually ends up really minimizing the attention paid to the most views, which are actually kind of in the center and totally reasonable, right? So you sort of end up with, on the one hand, attempts to give a sympathetic airing to far right views, and on the other hand, folks who are at the left of the political spectrum end up getting caricatured on Fox News as representing the views of a much, end up sort of getting blown out of proportion, or seen as the only views, when there's really a wide range of views among people who are very civically active. From the center to the left, there's a lot more political engagement than shows up in most renderings of sort of both sides today.
Yeah. So I guess, yeah, so I'd love, actually, before I go in, because I'm a talker, we have we have two other fine people here who actually have better questions than I do, but I'm really fast. So so I'm going to zip my lips, and we have I'm Vash, there's Margaret, and we have Rosalind. So either Margaret or Rosalind, if any of you have anything you want to say, and I'm going to be quiet for at least 15 seconds to let you have an opportunity to speak.
Well, I'm fascinated by the obvious, but I have considered, which is trying to find ways to connect with people outside of those I already am connected to, in order to have some opportunities, at least for discussion, and possibly, to engage someone in a way that they hadn't before. I'm also interested in the phrase "established narrative," because I find that it's very frustrating, as you were saying, to see how things are covered, and in some ways, say, covering angry white guys with guns it seems to be presented as, these are the real Americans. Which is not true. I mean, for one, America is made up of any number of variety of people from coast to coast, and to sort of default to, these heartland, folks as being the real face of America discounts everybody else. So I guess in our own state, one of the things that that we're interested in doing is, having seen what happened in Wisconsin and understanding that this will go on for quite some time, we're interested in promoting people to sign up for vote by mail. And I'm wondering if you see that as something that really is necessary and important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Pennsylvania is actually really lucky that vote by mail was written into, through the hard work of a whole bunch of activists, was written into and passed with bipartisan support in the last session, so that the infrastructure was there for no excuse vote by mail. So no need any further to demand to demonstrate an immediate medical need in order to request a vote by mail ballot. So all that infrastructure is there. It's just about ramping it up, and that's so Pennsylvania in that sense is in a much better place than it would have been, a year ago, when it would have been necessary to just invent from scratch the infrastructure for this. So, and I think it's the case. It looks like leaders in Philadelphia and in Allegheny County are going to try to move towards sending, proactively sending ballots out to all, or sending vote by mail ballot requests out to all registered voters. So that would be huge. I mean, the things that voting rights activists nationally say are particularly important in order to implement vote by mail systems in ways that are not exclusionary and don't just favor the most well-connected or the most educated voters, is sending the application out through the mail to all voters, having prepaid ballots so that people don't have to have, you know, a stamp in order to send the ballot back in. Having those ballots be accepted as valid votes as long as they are postmarked by the date of the election, so that it's not that it depends on the vagary of mail delivery whether or not the mail is delivered and whether or not the ballot is received by a certain date, but rather it's the postmark. And then having a fair process in place to verify signatures, and a fair process in place for voters whose signatures have been questioned to go confirm their ballots, right? So those are the things that need to be in place for a vote by mail system not to be disenfranchising people disproportionately. And so the Pennsylvania system absolutely can work that way. Some of those pieces are already set up in the law, and others can be added in on a county by county basis. And precisely because of the partisan divides of the different counties. So because counties like Allegheny County, Philadelphia County are very heavily Democratic and others are less so, and then others are not, because the population is so large, the number of voters in Philadelphia County and Allegheny County is so large, if the leaders in those counties push for making ballots freely available to increase voter turnout, which is just the right thing to do for democracy, period, actually leaders in the other counties are likely to follow, because otherwise those counties' votes are going to be less represented in the statewide totals. And so that creates like for once, a virtuous circle within politics in which, you know, leaders in just a few places have an incentive to make it easier for people to vote. And once they do that, other political leaders from across the state have a really big incentive to do the same and also make it easier for people to vote there, which is, you know, all good for democracy, right? So I think that for once, this is really a great opportunity. And then that means that, you know, activists should be absolutely reaching out and making sure that potential voters who are sympathetic to, you know, their candidates or their causes are being contacted by phone, most likely, or by text to encourage them to take advantage of the ballot that hits their doorstep. But the numbers are really clear. Even in the case of this most recent vote in Wisconsin, there were just a couple of municipalities that proactively sent out vote by mail applications, and they got a hugely increased, they like doubled or had like 50% or more higher rates of return of the ballots. So it can make even what might seem like, you know, a small thing, going from having to go online and spend, you know, 5 minutes online requesting the ballot to just having the ballot request arrive in your, you know, mail, makes a huge difference in the number of people who actually do vote.
And especially because not everybody has access to internet, and that's
exactly right.
We don't think about that, and it's one thing that we when we're thinking about doing our digital virtual activism, we are automatically excluding people because we aren't able to, like, for example, this conversation, how are we going to get it to people who don't have internet access? And that's it's a thing.
Yep. So absolutely. And one, I think, you know, there are a couple of different sort of untapped frontiers of or underutilized frontiers for activism, because I think when people say, oh, we should be thinking about social or media, people immediately go to things that, you know, sit on the internet, right? If it's Twitter or if it's Facebook. But what about radio? Right? Like, radio remains a really important space of communication in rural areas and urban areas, and that's probably a space where the voices of sort of new activists are underrepresented. So are there local radio personalities who you might want to invite on here to talk? Are there different ways that you can connect up with different radio programs? Or because precisely it's reaching, because again, it's that goal of saying, like, where's the politically heterogeneous, where's the politically diverse network that we can tap into? And radio is going to be one of those spaces. Newspapers are also since newspaper readership skews older, skews less internet engaged. So, you know, so letters to the editor of newspapers that are physically printed in physical newspapers that reach people's doors are actually very important, even though it's usually not on the top, 5 list when people think about what kinds of activism can we be doing. Writing letters to the editor of newspapers, if that one letter is read by, even a fraction of the subscribers to the print edition of the newspaper, all of those people are going to be seeing those views maybe for the first time, because those aren't people who you're hitting through your usual online networks of connection.
Margaret, we haven't heard as much from you, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak, because then I cut you off again. Go ahead.
Okay. I've noticed in myself, and I think in other people I've spoken to, that since I've withdrawn into my home for safety, I'm far less engaged. And part of the value of the engagement before was every Tuesday, I got to go downtown and see people that I didn't see the rest of the week and get a sort of refreshment of my activism and my optimism that we are making a difference. How can we continue with that while we're all prisoners in our homes?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, I've seen groups really benefit from creating a virtual meeting for their core activists.
We're doing.
Exactly. So whether that's, every Tuesday night or, once a week or every other week. And that's about, you can sort of think of this as the difference between, taking care of the core network in, facing inwards, as being an important complement to that work of figuring out how are we going to reach outwards along more, attenuated networks, or networks that are not, that are new, and that are, where sometimes it feels kind of scary to think, okay, how am I going to reach out, go knock on my neighbor's door, or leave a flyer for my neighbor about a Zoom meeting that I'm organizing. Going out into that space feels like a little daunting, and you need to go having been energized by your connections of the inward facing connections, right? And part of what you're describing is the way that going to show up every week for Tuesdays with Toomey used to be that space of energizing, sort of confirming, like, here's our action item, we've got a plan, it's going to make a difference, we're going to act together. So that's the other piece, super important of this moment, is figuring out how do we do that work of connecting inward and nurturing ourselves and each other, and strengthening ourselves to take that step outward. So I think a lot of groups are relying on Zoom, building in meetings, weekly or every other week. And it's possible that, so I've seen people, experimenting with doing phone banking, but from being on a Zoom call together, so you can actually see each other, having everyone mute themselves, doing the phone banking, but so that then they can still take breaks and be, jump into the chat box on Zoom and, talk with other folks while they're taking the breaks, and then mute themselves again and make some more phone calls, as a way of being together, being encouraged to go that extra mile, make those extra 5 phone calls, and not having that feel like something that you're just doing, as like a leap of faith on your own, from the 4 walls of your own room.
Indivisible Philadelphia has collective postcarding events where you can come and go as works for you, and you're talking to other people while you're writing postcards.
Yeah. So some groups have done group writing sessions for writing letters to the editor.
That's what we're doing this week. Yeah, but I love the idea of doing the group phone banking, and I think a part of we've had some communication, like in the sense of we're used to being able to disseminate communication in a certain way because we had a centralized meeting point, and then we had planned to do a weekly evening gathering, and then we didn't do as well, and I put this on there were some issues with communicating it to our actual membership, which we're working on to try and improve. So, and hopefully we will have done that. like by the time you are watching this. So it's all a work in progress. That's like the and there are lots of other groups also, like Indivisible Philadelphia has been doing group postcarding events. There's a lot of room for more such events like this, which we want to be able to do. I love the group phone banking. I think that's a fantastic idea. And go ahead, Roz.
No, I was wondering if there are other things that you want to make sure to tell us about before we wrap up.
No, I'm just eager to, keep learning from the work that you all are doing, because I think, the big picture of the last 3.5 years has been one of citizen activism really outpacing what any of the top-down supposed experts would have thought possible or would have come up with or would have, planned for. And so I have a lot of faith in the sort of creativity and trial and error connection building of folks like you and folks like your networks who are listening into this talk. So I think there are probably some key new innovations that that we need to hear about. That someone's right now, someone somewhere is trying something that's working pretty well for them, whether that's about like flyers to the neighborhood about the Zoom meeting, or
postcards so that you can support the post office.
Yeah.
Postcard stamps.
So I think one thing which is interesting to me is how these the overlapping between different groups. So there's I at a guess each of you is both part of the Tuesdays with Toomey network and also connected to whether it's Pennsylvania Together, Turn PA Blue, Indivisible Philadelphia, your local township committee. So that means that techniques and things that people come up with that work well actually diffuse pretty rapidly across different grassroots groups. People learn from each other and share, and thank goodness, because we've all got to be doing lots of learning right now and coming up with new ways of engaging our communities.
Well, thank you so much. We're so glad you were here to talk with us, and you gave us, at least you gave me, and I know everyone else here, some really wonderful ideas.
Yeah.
And we really
notes.
Yeah, thank you. It just was fascinating to hear the information that you were sharing, and and I can also feel your enthusiasm, which helps me feel enthusiastic.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm really delighted to have been invited to participate, and we'll be happy to, we'll be eager to touch base again, and keep learning from everything that you guys are doing.
Absolutely, and you're welcome to join us for some of our other sessions. You don't even have to be recorded and interviewed if you don't want to.
There we go. Excellent.
We'd love to.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And I'm stopping the recording now.
Okay.